just, Aaron, so Aaron, can we just circulate that? That would be great. Okay, so I'm so delighted that you're all here. And we're really excited that Elizabeth Badley's joined us today for the inaugural lecture for this year's seminar series. Elizabeth's known as the guru of arthritis research, not just nationally but internationally, and we're very fortunate to have her here. She's got so many hats. Senior scientist at the Toronto Western Research Institute and scientific division head of research there. She also, of course, is a professor next door at Dalai Lama, and is the director of the Arthritis Community Arthritis Community Research and Evaluation Unit, which I believe you started, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And then UHN's Arthritis and Autoimmunity Research Center. She's an adjunct scientist with the Institute for Clinical and Evaluative Sciences, which we used to call ISIS, but I imagine they're working on their acronym. So she's done so many interesting things and is a fantastic epidemiologist, and actually really cares about the translation of her ivory tower work to people on the street with arthritis and practitioners. And so we're very, very fortunate to have you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm going to mention arthritis, but I'm not primarily going to be talking about arthritis. I'm going to be talking about the health of baby boomers and how their health compares to other generations. This work was funded by CIHR, and it was really sort of one of my it was a proof of concept, almost grant application, because it had a competition for secondary analysis. And we got so fed up being turned down for research on arthritis because arthritis doesn't matter, that I thought, well, let's put in a sexy grant and see whether a sexy topic gets funded. So we put in a grant on the health of baby boomers. And that has led us down all sorts of interesting paths, and I'm going to talk about some of those paths now. Okay, page down, where am I going? There we are. So, first of all, I'm going to remind you who the baby boomers are. I probably don't need to remind you. I'm going to talk about why they're important, why they might be different from other generations, and why their health matters. I'm going to talk about how we study differences between generations, because it's not easy. I'm going to talk about our research question, and then briefly talk about my results on self-rated health arthritis. I just discovered I'm webcast, so I'm not going to talk about our results on disability. And I'm done with some conclusions. So, who are the baby boomers? I'll get into this. So, the issue for the research, really the background of this research, is the fact that the older members of the baby boomer generation are just beginning to reach retirement age. In fact, have just reached retirement age, if you think of retirement at 65. And what impact this is going to have, the aging baby boomers is going to have on the health services and policies related to older people is unknown. We just don't know. So why is this important? First of all, this was an unprecedentedly large generation, as I'll show you in a minute. And secondly, it's a notion that baby boomers are different from the preceding generation. I'm a baby boomer. No, we're different. We're special. And there's very little published research when you look at it about the health of baby boomers specifically. So, who are the baby boomers? For the purposes of this talk, these are the generation that were born between 1945 and actually I say 65 here, it should be 64, typo. So we've taken a 20-year span. And if you look at the number of births in Canada, you can see that over the years that there was a big spike starting around about 1945-46, reaching a peak sometime sort of round about late 50s, early 50s, and then declining again. So this sort of gives us a sort of rough age span from returning war veterans, fueled by immigration, of a large increase in birth rate. And this is a population pyramid of Canada, which is the 2011 census. And you can see here the baby boomers. So a large generation. I mean, in 2011, they were, the biggest number were aged sort of between 45 and up. they were just reaching retirement age. Now we've just advanced that 5 years. The oldest members of the baby boomer generation have started to retire. I mean, I'm assuming here an average age of retirement. And there are generations as follows. There's the children of the baby boomers, Gen X's, and then the parents of the baby boomers. And I'll tell you about the generations later. But there is an idea that baby boomers have different characteristics from older generations. There's a magazine called Zoomer. I mean, the guy who founded it has a name beginning with Z, so he did that in the name, but Zoomer doesn't rhyme with boomer. And it addresses people over the age of sort of 50, 55.
Actually 45.
I stand corrected.
Which is foolish.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to go there. When Michelle Obama became 50, CNN had this big spread saying, fabulous at 50, and she was interviewed. And CNN wrote or said, is 50 today a whole lot different from the age of 50 20 or 30 years ago? They obviously did a poll survey at that time, and we asked women across the country who've already reached a half-century milestone to weigh in, and most agreed with Obama. 50 is really fabulous, and they concluded that 50 is the new 40. When Oprah Winfrey reached 60, she went even a decade further and said 60 is the new 40. And there was even a scholarly book about baby boomers based on a conference entitled, Can My 80s Be Like My 50s? So the media clearly believe, and we, and to the extent we influence the media, clearly believe that we're different. So why does the health of the aging baby boomer generation matter? Well, it matters because aging, health, and the use of healthcare are intimately related. If we look at age-specific mortality, it really takes off after the age of 65. So the boomers, I'm sad to say, are beginning to enter the dying age. If we look at healthcare utilization, we have this peak in women in younger age groups, obviously related to childbearing, and then from the age of 65 up, the rate of, this is the cost of physician services, doctor visits kind of mirror this, we begin to use more healthcare. So the concern is for the healthcare system. It's an American slide, I apologize, but we've got this great big bus coming along of a large number of baby boomers who are going to hit the healthcare system. There's nothing we can do about this. I mean, there are a lot of us. But the big question is it going to be worse than we expected or better than we expected in terms of demands for healthcare? And I'm going to look not so much at demands for healthcare here, but I'm just going to look at health and what we can potentially learn about this by looking at our health. But first of all, I've got to backtrack a little bit and talk about how we study changes of health over time and between generations. And here we've got to sort of think about the things that might affect health over time. First of all, age. As we get older, we change. We just need to look in the mirror to know. And so age effects are the consequences of growing older. How things change with age, irrespective of birth cohort. Happens to everyone. Another thing that affects how we age and how things affect it are the consequences of influence that vary through time. So these are changes that affect the entire population, irrespective of age and birth cohort. They might be new treatments. So for example, very few people go into hospital now for open surgery. A lot of surgery is done through keyhole surgery. Things like new uses of MRI. The baby boomers had a period effect in the fact that they were the first generation to get antibiotics, which was a big change which affected the whole population. So these can be things that happen slowly, like new treatments and change, or they can be once-off things like environmental disasters. You know, the children who were alive in Japan at the time of the tsunami and were exposed to the radiation of Fukushima think, are going to have a cohort effect. There will be a cohort effect in things like thyroid cancer. So there are these a cohort effect caused by a period effect. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Policies, the economies are all, government cutbacks are all things that affect us all. And then finally, there are the consequences, the cohort effects, and these are the consequences of being born and growing up at different times. And these are changes according to your year of birth, irrespective of birth and calendar time. So I just mentioned antibiotics. As a baby boomer, I was one of the first generations to get antibiotics, which makes us different from the previous generation. I'll talk about some of the generational differences in a minute. So we carry with us, as we get older, three effects: the effect of aging, the things that's happened in the world around us, and the unique things that we share with our generation. And to carry these out, we have to do some special analyses, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. I just want to talk about the cohorts, because I haven't mentioned which cohorts I'm going to look at. So for my first comparison is the World War II cohort. These are people born between 1935 and 44. They were born during the later years of the Depression and in the shadow of World War II. So they had a unique experience in their growing up and childhood years. And then they were parents in the 50s, when the economy boomed and everyone had lots of children. The baby boomers were born between 45 and 64, and they grew up in an era of increasing affluence. They had educational opportunities, employment opportunities that other people didn't have. Often they were the first generation to go to university in their families. I've mentioned antibiotics. They were the first generation to have antibiotics. They were one of the first generation to have a wide range of immunizations. We grew up in an environment of accelerating diagnostic, other technologies and therapies. So lots of things were happening in healthcare that affected this generation and older generations. They became, as adults, the first generation to have oral contraceptives, and which had huge implications for the role of women. Many of us are still working because of smaller families and the affluence that baby boomer generation brought. And for this study, we've actually divided these into two cohorts. The older baby boomers. Now, these are the ones who are really special because they came of age in an era of enormous social change. The Beatles, I'm British, Beatles, growing up. Woodstock, flower power, women's liberation, burning bras, remember that? The Kennedy assassination. For those of you who are old enough, you probably know exactly where you were when you heard the Kennedy has been assassinated. In America, Vietnam War was hugely important, but throughout the world, this generation protested. The younger baby boomers, they were born between 55 and 64. They were born in an age of prosperity, but they actually came of age after the peak of the economic boom had passed, and they entered the labour force when many of the best positions had been taken. And then Generation X, my final generation that I'm looking at, they were born between 65 and 74. They're a smaller generation, probably thanks to the oral contraceptive pill. They inherited, though, the advances in education and healthcare. They were the first generation whose mothers worked outside the home, or most of whose mothers worked outside the home. And they grew up in a time of economic downturn, and when they reached maturity, it was an era of high or rather higher unemployment. So we might expect there are quite potentially distinct generational differences. So my research question is the health of the baby boomer generation different from that of older and younger generations? And there's some evidence to suggest that it might or it should be better, and I'll just review that evidence. First of all, the death rate, especially from heart disease in Canada, is declining. So here, if you look at the solid line, you can see in dark blue for males and light blue for females, you can see it's going down. This is the death rate for heart disease. Cancer, nothing very much is happening. Possibly a little bit of downturn towards in more recent years, but sort of cancer is I always think it's a bit of a wild card. It's there, but heart disease has been going down, which is good news. And conversely, life expectancy in Canada has been increasing. It's now, I think, in the early 80s for women, and it's getting there for men. And the gap between men and women has been closing. And also, there's been big changes in the determinants of health. There's strong research, very, very strong research evidence to show that better health is associated with higher education and literacy. That if you have higher income and associated with it, higher social status, you have better health. We all know about not smoking. We all know about having a healthy weight and being physically active, but all of these contribute to better health. And there are a whole bunch of other health determinants like early childhood development, housing, nutrition, the physical environment, water health, air, healthy workplaces. And all these things have changed over the years and got better. I mean, the standard of housing that we have now is vastly different from the standard of housing that many of us grew up in, particularly the baby boomers. We've talked about preventive health services, and there are social support networks which change over time. I'm not sure whether they're better or worse. So let's look at some of the changes in the determinants of health. First of all, education. According to the Canadian census, in 1951, only 2% of the population had a university degree. By 2010, it was 27%. Huge increase. This looks at income, looks at final wage, and it says, that the real wages have quadrupled between 1920 and 1990 for both men and women. It's been very difficult actually to dig out these data because they're not always published in a way that you want them, but you can see a steady trend in increasing incomes over time. Sort of leveled off a bit, sadly, in the 1990s, but still an enormous increase which will affect its health over time. And, oh, hang on, back, page down. So I couldn't see that here, smoking. Smoking had a steady downward trend, thanks in part to Canada leading the way in restrictions in smoking, both in workplaces and package inserts and all these things. So smoking has gone down on that, and people attribute at least some of the decline to heart disease to that. However, not all the changes are good, and we also know about the so-called obesity epidemic. And particularly looking here at the bottom slide, you can see that not only has obesity been going up as a whole, but particularly class 1 and class 2 obesity. So obesity is defined as a body mass index over 30, class 2 body mass index over 35, class 2 over 40. And this has been accelerating, so we've been getting gradually more likely to be overweight, and the distribution has been shifting upwards towards obesity. More obesity, which is not good news, and you'll see more about that later. So our study objectives were to examine birth cohort and pardon me, period effects and the trajectories of health over 16 years in a representative sample of Canadians. And we had our general hypotheses were that there will be birth cohort and or period effects in health such that younger cohorts have better health. So we expect that younger cohorts will have better health. And we also expect that any differences in either birth cohort or period differences in health will be associated with birth or cohort differences in socioeconomic status. So I'm using SES as an abbreviation for education or income here. Smoking and obesity as measured by body mass index. The data source we used for this was the Canadian Longitudinal National Population Health Survey, which is a nationally representative community sample. We've been followed every 2 years for 16 years, from 1994 through to 2010. And we've got our 4 birth cohorts at baseline. So we've got World War II, 50 to 59, younger baby, older baby boomers, younger baby boomers, and then finally Gen X born between 65 and 74. So, I mean, us baby boomers can identify our generations. If you're not a baby boomer, you know, your parents or your grandparents are almost certainly in these generations. And at the beginning of this stuff, they're all relatively young. Your oldest person is 70. So we're not talking here about old people, we're talking about aging through the sort of key part of life. And as I indicated, age, period and cohort are intimately related. We just can't separate them. But we can, with longitudinal data, with data where we have multiple observations over time, we can try and separate out the effect of aging from the effect of cohort and from the effect of period of time. And one of the key things is to be able to compare different cohorts at the same age. So, well, I'll illustrate this later, but so we can see that, you know, are people who are, say, 60 now different from people who were 60 10 years ago, or who will be 60 10 years in the future? And we can also look at changes over time because we've got a 16-year time period to look at that. And we can try and see how that affects aging and different cohorts. So to do this, we use some complex statistical modeling called age, period, and cohort models to get information about the separate effects over time. We use multi-level growth models, and I'm just going to cut all the statistics. I'm just going to get straight to the results. If anybody's a statistical fiend and wants to see tables and p-values and things like that, I've got some tucked away at the end and I can talk to you later, but I'm just going to cut straight to the good stuff. So first of all, results. The first indicator of health we looked at was self-rated health. This is a remarkable variable. It's a simple question. In general, would you say your health is excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor? And how people answer this has been shown to be the predictor of mortality, healthcare utilization, morbidity, the onset of chronic conditions. People who say their health is fair or poor. I hope none of you are saying your health is fair or poor, because I have to tell you it doesn't all go well. Statistically. I mean, one of my sort of things is, you know, we also know that mental health is also important, and I'm talking mainly about physical health. And you feel better if you smile. So I think every morning we should look in the mirror. We should smile widely and say, my health is excellent. And then you'll probably live forever. That's my secret. Now, you have to wait a number of years to see whether it's true. Anyway, this is scored. You know, 1 for excellent, 5 for poor, and we recorded this in a continuous scale so we could fiddle with it statistically. And to our surprise, we didn't find any age cohort effects in this. So this slide, you're going to see lots of slides like this. You'll see some, we'll show you some cohort effects later, so you will know they do exist. So Gen X is red, World War II is yellow, younger baby boomers are green, older baby boomers are blue. The way this is scaled is that better health is a higher score. So you can see that as people get older, their health gets worse. You know, surprise, surprise, right? No surprise. But you can also see that line I've drawn, that at age about 44 years, the health of 3 generations is pretty much the same. So people who are, 44 now, same health as people who were 44 10 years ago. So, but we were surprised by this. So we went and looked at it in a little bit more detail, because we didn't expect to find this. So first of all, we tried to put in the effect of period. We put in a statistical term which said, let's pretend there's been no change over time. And when we look and see whether there's change over time, we can see in fact that cohort differences is perhaps, if anything, younger people actually have slightly worse health than the older generation. This is just, but that's only very small statistically, so I'm not, you know, I wouldn't want to sort of go to court and say yes, but because you know it comes out of the statistical manipulation, the modelling of the data, but it's suggestive. I'll come back. This will be a recurring theme. I'm warning you. So our first set of conclusions was there were no substantial cohort effects, contrary to our hypothesis. But we also found that younger cohorts do not have better health, which is what we kind of expected. And that overall, I'm just going to go back on, health is slightly better than it would have been if there had been no period changes. Because all the solid lines are sort of higher up at the better health side of the graph than the dotted lines, when we've held period constant. So there seems to be a sort of a little bit of a societal shift towards good health, which is good. Okay, but we then went to look at the effect of other factors. Now, the literature, previous work, and our analyses have shown that better health, if you have more education, you have a higher income, you're a non-smoker, and you have normal BMI, you have better self-rated health. And I've already shown you there have been huge changes in these things over time, in education, income, smoking, and obesity. So what impact might have these changes have had on self-rated health? So we set about to look at the effect of the effect of education, income, BMI, and smoking on self-rated health. So first of all, I'm going to actually look at the raw data and look at the individual variables themselves. And here you see a huge cohort effect in education, as we might expect. So this is the youngest generation, and they have more years of schooling than World War II generation, and each generation has on average more years of schooling. And this is a huge cohort effect. And when we do our what if and say, well, if there'd been no period changes, we still see a cohort effect. Bit reduced, but there's still cohort effect. Income. Income has increased dramatically. Income generally increases over age until you get into the older generation when, sadly, it begins to go down, and there's those of us who are approaching retirement are becoming really familiar with this concept. But you can also see there's a huge cohort effect that each generation has higher income at the same age. And when we control for the passage of time, in fact, we actually don't see relatively few cohort differences, and you can think of this actually as controlling for inflation. So, you know, one way of actually thinking about controlling for period is, I mean, it comes out very clearly in income, is think of it as sort of the analogy of controlling for inflation, controlling for changes over time. So, in fact, once we actually control for changes over time in income, we actually see relatively few period cohort effects. And in fact, if anything, the cohort thing is reduced in that the younger cohorts can have slightly lower income than they might have been predicted, which is what the economists are telling us anyway. That our children's generation isn't doing as well. Okay, smoking, huge cohort effect. Smoking declines with age, and each generation is less likely to smoke. And once we control for period, we still see a cohort effect. A true cohort effect with age. So a lot of this steep decline is to do with changes over time, but there is a still cohort effect in smoking. So younger people are less likely to smoke. And BMI, once again, cohort effect. Each younger generation is more likely to be obese. We control for the period of time, and it's still true. Okay, so what effect does this have on self-rated health? So, okay, my conclusions. There are cohort differences in education, income, smoking, and BMI, and these differences are reduced for education and smoking and eliminated almost for income and BMI after controlling for period. So a lot of these cohort differences are not related to birth cohort as such, but are related to changes in the environment over time, which is just to say that every cohort is a period, birth cohort is basically a child of the generation in which they were born, but also is influenced by everything that happens in the world around them. So what are the implications for our understanding of self-rated health? So this is what I showed you before, no cohort effect, and this is the predicted population average. And we did a couple of what-ifs, right? So our first what-if was, what if there had been no improvements in socioeconomic status, no improvements in education or income? We gave everybody the income of education incomes of the World War II generation, and there'd been no improvements in smoking. So if there hadn't been these improvements, our health would have been worse. So this line is lower. So overall, the health of the population would be worse. So thank you, prosperity, education, and non-smoking. You know, as far as that's concerned, you have improved our health. Well, those improvements have improved our health. But we also said, well, okay, let's assume everybody had normal weight, nobody became obese. What would have happened to our health? Well, our health is worse because of the increasing BMI in the population. And when we put the two together, we see that part of the explanation for the lack of cohort effect, or the lack of the changes over time, is that the increases we would have had in health due to improvements in education, income, and not smoking have been at least partially offset by increases of obesity. So when we actually look at, in fact, when we think about the impact of obesity on the health of the population, we're underestimating. So that's what I just said. It's counterbalanced by the effect of increasing education, income, and smoking is counterbalanced by the period effect of increasing BMI. So if there hadn't been increases in obesity, we might have expected to see better self-rated health. And as self-rated health is associated with use of healthcare as baby boomers, we actually have forgone, we've lost a potential decrease in use of healthcare as baby boomers age. The other sort of general point is, because most of these are accounted for by period effects, the public health message means that the changes affect all generations. And so if we actually want to try and do something about it, we can target everybody. We don't need to target a particular generation or a specific age group. But these are sort of far-reaching societal changes which have affected the health of us all. So I'm going to move on now to understanding the link between the determinants of health and chronic diseases and worse health. And so on the pathway between the determinants of health and worse health, whether that be poor self-rated health or disability, is chronic diseases. And surprise, surprise, I'm going to put the spotlight on arthritis because that's where I do a lot of my work. We do find there are cohort differences in the prevalence of arthritis. See, arthritis increases steeply with age, starting sort of from about the mid-40s. And this is looking at the predicted trajectory of age in the population for the 4 cohorts. And you can see that at the same age, so we look at 44 here, more of the Gen X will have report arthritis than the younger baby boomers than the older baby boomers. So arthritis seems to be getting more prevalent. When we hold period constant, the cohort effect goes. So we know that, or we can think that the changes, increasing prevalence of arthritis, is something to do with things that are happening in the environment as a whole, not things that are affecting particular age groups. So basically, I've just shown in graphs. This says the results in words, the prevalence of arthritis. Okay, we then actually looked and, sorry, I keep getting ahead of myself here. Is this the problem? We looked at the predictors of arthritis. Now we know that arthritis, people of high education and high income, like all aspects of health, are less likely to report arthritis. And we also know that if you're a current smoker or if you're obese, you're more likely to have arthritis. We know this from statistical studies in the population. We also see it in our data. So when we did the same kind of thing for arthritis as we did for self-rated health, and here, rather than putting everything on one graph so it gets all very muddled up, we've separated out the generations. So we can see, just looking at Gen X at the top, if there had been, and this is sort of the other way around in the sense, if there'd been no increases in socioeconomic status, so no improvements in education or income, and no decrease in smoking, there would have been more people with arthritis. On the other hand, if we had assumed no increases in obesity, there would have been less people with arthritis. And once again, we're seeing this almost counterbalancing. Obesity undoing the good that other aspects of health have done. So our findings suggest that cohort effects of more arthritis in younger cohorts is partially explained by period effects, such as benefits of increased education, income, smoking, and these have been partially offset by increases in BMI over time. But only partially, because when we actually look at it in more detail, this isn't the whole story. Something else is happening, and we don't quite know what. It may be that younger people are more likely to report arthritis because they're seeing all the adverts on the TV, they're more engaged in physical activity, they're more likely to have injuries, and we know injury can cause osteoarthritis. On the other hand, it may be a real effect, that something is happening so that younger people are more likely to get arthritis. We haven't got to the bottom of it, and we don't really understand it. We have some speculations. It does mean that our understanding of body mass index of obesity and arthritis is likely to be an underestimate, particularly at the population level. And it has huge implications for future need for healthcare. Because younger cohorts have more arthritis, they're going to be making more doctor's visits and demanding more healthcare. So it's a concern. And we're likely to see similar effects with other chronic conditions such as heart disease and diabetes, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Because all of these diseases are also influenced by smoking, BMI and education and income. So I'm going to briefly deal with our sort of third category, which is disability, needing help with daily activities. And so the survey asked about needing help with daily activities. It's mainly due to chronic conditions. And the survey asked about people who need the help of another person for things like preparing meals, shopping, heavy housework, for personal care, and moving about. And so people who said yes, they needed help were coded as having a disability. Now, I haven't written this paper up yet, so I'm not going to tell you what the results were. But what I will say is there are some reasons to suppose that it is not necessarily a good news story. So this slide was taken from data on the global burden of health, and it looks at, in the top part of the slide, years of life lost per 100,000 population. And you can see that as mortality has gone down, the years of life that have been lost per 100,000 population have declined. The same, this is World Health Organization, the same organization did calculations and looked at years of life with disability per 100,000. And you can see there's a kind of counterbalancing of the two. I told you earlier that it was particularly heart disease that had gone where the decline in death rate was, and this looks at the global burden of disease for cardiovascular and circulatory diseases, so heart and stroke, mainly heart. See, once again it goes down, and years of life lost due to disability due to cardiovascular diseases have gone up. So it's an interesting conclusion that the development of life-saving procedures and better treatment actually can have a collateral effect of increasing the number of people living with substantial disability. Or else the number of people living to develop chronic diseases such as arthritis that they might have not developed had they not lived so long. But it also really suggests that when we start evaluating the benefits of interventions and evaluating what we're doing, instead of saying, yay, we're living longer, you know, people can live now, we'll be able to live to 100 and whatever, that we think, hey, wait a minute, come back, what kind of quality of life are they going to have? Because we actually might be paying a bit of a steep price for living longer. Now, it's a very contentious area, and gives you food. I think it gives you somewhat food for thought. Personally, I have no desire to live to be 100. Just like all of you, I just hope for at some appropriate time, which sort of gets further and further away as I get older. But I'll just not wake up one morning. But that's another whole other issue. So, in conclusions, as far as health goes, 60 is not the new 40. In fact, the new 40 may be the new 60. The now 40 may be the new 60, but I can't go that far. But Oprah, I'm sorry, you're very privileged because of your high income and high education. But for the population as a whole, 60 is not the new 40. On the contrary, at the population level, there's some slight suggestion that the health of younger cohorts is worse than that of older cohorts. Also, the health benefits of increasing education and income and smoking cessation have been almost offset by increasing obesity, which actually has huge demands for the future need for healthcare. We seem to have increased the prevalence of disability in younger cohorts, as we saw with the sort of World Bank data. So perhaps we need to pay more attention to quality of life rather than just length of life. What we're doing now, in fact, our next steps is to investigate cohort effects in the use of healthcare and whether there are cohort differences by socioeconomic status. And this is, I've got a graduate student who's doing her PhD on this. So I have to give enormous credit to my colleague, Maya Canizares, who's been the lead investigator for the statistical analysis. She's done things that I couldn't do. And my co-investigators, Monique Gignac, Sheila Hogg-Johnson, and Anthony Prucha. Thank you. So and while the thing's up, you can see how many of these people you can identify. But I haven't been able to find what the key is, so I can't answer questions about that. I looked up and I tried to Google it to see if I could find out who they all were, but I couldn't, and a quick Google couldn't find out, but some of them you'll recognize.
Oprah, isn't she the one next on number one is Oprah?
Could be, yeah, it could be. There's Clinton, I think, is second one in.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And Mick Jagger's there somewhere, who I... That's Mick Jagger, and Mick Jagger's next to 50.
Yeah.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah. And I think Bill Gates is there somewhere, who might be next to Bill.
Above him.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Above, the one next to Oprah and above.
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, thank you very much. So we have some time for questions or comments.
I may have missed this, but was there a gender breakdown?
The answer is yes and no. We did look at gender. Of course we looked at gender. Self-rated health, the gender differences were negligible. So we, in presenting the results, put them together. There were some slight differences, but there was nothing that changed the overall story. And we've published self-rated health in the Millbank Quarterly, and in writing the paper, we agonized about whether we should do it by gender, but it was just too much information. So we said, no, gender doesn't change the story, therefore we're not going to we're going to put them together. With arthritis, once again, it's the same story. Yes, there are gender differences. More women do have arthritis than men, that's for sure. But the story, the bottom line of our story with regard to the cohort differences and relating to the determinants of health don't change. So for presentation, we put them together. When we start to look at disability, once again, there may be differences, and it may be that women are more affected than men, but we're looking. But generally, things are in the same direction in both genders. So gender isn't a major thing. The big determinant is socioeconomic status, and because we're here, by definition, we're all very privileged because we wouldn't be here if we didn't have high education.
I think it's interesting that you're talking about arthritis in the 40s, but I think the other disability that's going to become quite prevalent is hearing disability.
Oh, yes.
Because of the noise levels that have increased so dramatically.
Yeah. Interestingly, actually, hearing disability is something we have our bucket list of things we want to do, and hearing disability is one of them. And hearing disability is quite interesting. In fact, if you think of changes in the environment. Older cohorts are going to be exposed to a lot more industrial noise.
Right.
We've all been exposed to traffic in the street, and in fact, over time, the average noise level of traffic in the street has gone down. Cars are quieter now than they were before.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, actually it's a problem for people with vision loss.
They can't hear them.
Because they can't hear them.
Yeah, and you think of the now hybrid cars are very
The
quiet.
hybrid cars and the electronic vehicles,
Yeah.
the scooters. and so
But
on.
just generally, the normal combustion engine is less noisy than it used to be. Then the other thing that's happened to younger generations is things stuck in their ears.
All the time.
Yeah, and loud.
Yeah.
And now, in fact, the headphones people wear is worse, because at one time you could always, if you sat near the subway, you could sort of hear the sound leaking out. Now the sound doesn't leak out anymore because they have the buds right in their ears, and this is causing deafness in younger people.
Yeah, you don't get it.
No. So there are huge cohort differences, and this is a really quite interesting one, because these cohort differences truly are both cohort differences of things that different generations have been exposed to through their growing up times. So that's on our bucket list.
Good.
And we do, and our first quick pass. I mean, there are decided cohort differences there. What we haven't done is done the statistics to dig in what might be underlying.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. My husband and I just came back from a very memorable trip to South Africa and Botswana.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our very many excellent guides of Zulu background from Soweto, which is a very regular stop on the tour agenda, made the comment that one of the many ways we were very fortunate was that we had our parents into their 80s and 90s, where he said almost everyone there loses their parents by the 70s, by their 70s. So just one of the very many sobering thoughts of being in a hopeful situation, but still with huge inequality, which way outweighs anything in North America.
Well, if you just look at life expectancy in Canada, it's changed. I mean, 20, 30, 40 years ago, we were in that situation where, people were, longevity was, it's just, life expectancy has increased. I mean, Soweto in South Africa is sort of trailing sort of 50 or 60 years behind the Western world in terms of industrialization. I mean, the date of retirement at 65, I think, was fixed when people would only have 2 or 3 years life of expectation after retirement. Now it's about 20, and and various countries are now fighting politically to actually put the age of retirement up. But the other,
But may I say, a city like Johannesburg, we never actually were downtown. We were in another neighborhood in a very nice hotel, and then we were driven through Soweto, which is 3 million people, which varies between
place in the world.
extremely modern and beautiful in that skyscraper way, but huge differences. But a lot of solar and use of solar power, like solar water heaters everywhere.
Yeah.
So very advanced in some ways and still held back by so much. So
I mean, it'd be interesting to look at differences in different countries.
Just as an aside, has anybody ever looked at the stress levels on the boomers whose parents are living to these extraordinary ages? Because being in that particular position myself with a mother who's 94 and probably going to outlive me, already has outlived one of her children, the stress of caregiving, even when they're not, say, living with them, but but managing the health problems and the money and the juggling of I've got problems with this, that, and the other. What?
I mean, that's the downside of living longer. I mean,
it's killing off the boomers.
But not my area of research, but there are people who've done. I mean, not including I think a number of people here at the U of T who've done research on, on caregiving. And the so-called sandwich generation, people who have to care for both older and younger people. So there is research on that.
And it's not my area particularly, but the whole sandwich generation, and sometimes they call them the Dagwood sandwich when you've got, I do work on grandchildren, so you might have the grandchildren and the children and the parents.
I call it, are you a sandwich or a hamburger?
But I think you're raising an interesting point that I haven't seen publications come out on, is, okay, now we're moving the sandwich generation, the person in the middle is now moving into their 70s, potentially in their 70s themselves. And that's a little bit different picture than the mass research that came out 20 years ago, which were more looking at primarily women in their 50s and 60s taking care of parents who were in their 70s and 80s. You're saying, well, as we shift it up and we have our own...
Isn't it a really interesting question?
It's a superb question.
Yeah.
Just to add on to that, what is happening is that we have 4 generations, not 3 generations.
Yes.
And that it is the baby boomers who are now looking after parents, and who parents may not be able to look after grandparents anymore. So all of these are shifting around, and it's a very, very interesting problem where at least economics can help, and you mentioned that education can help, but that's not the total picture for the aging population.
But
No, it's
even about
interesting.
the economics, it doesn't really fix the problem. You're still the overseer of the financial.
There's always someone who's the overseer.
Yeah, that's right.
Every
Yes.
family.
But also,
Which translates into stress.
You're right,
I mean,
absolutely.
and the other issue is, I mean, it's not just stress. I mean, I think, if you are in your sort of 60s, and perhaps even 70s, looking after your 80, 90-year-old parents, your physical health is not going to be good.
Caregiver burnout.
Caregiver burnout. But it's also, I mean, independently of caregiver burnout, you've got underneath that, you've got declining health, and then you put that on top of it.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, there's not many students here, but this is a huge area for growth and future research, and there's the 4 generational families and what happens, particularly if what we're seeing is true, in fact, that younger generations are in fact actually not in as good health as we were at the same age. So
I just have a comment, which was, I have never seen so clearly presented the impact, the fact that our understanding of obesity, and we know that obesity is really bad in the long term, but that we're underestimating it consistently because we've had all those gains with respect to lower smoking and better education. So even the bad effects that we see are really understating the case, and so I thought
at
that
least
was
at the
quite
population
profound.
level, yeah.
Quite profound.
We've got one more question from there, and then
Yeah, the interesting thing about the education is that, really just saying that a person's got a certain level of education will affect their longevity or their health or whatever. It actually isn't that, it's what they know and how they apply it. And so if it's being applied in the smoking and eating well and all that sort of thing, but not when it comes to obesity, then is it really having the impact that
I mean, we struggled actually with how to analyse education as well, because I mean some of our metrics of education obviously are generational, like what proportion go to university. I mean, you know, when we've analysed it every which way, and it still comes out, so that's okay. But it's not just what you know. I think it's some of the, you know, it's some of the things that go with education. Probably, you know, better housing, higher health literacy, better able to communicate with doctors and other caregivers. I mean, it's I mean all those things that you say, but it's not just your own behaviour. It's how you interact with the world around you and the kind of world that you are able to live in by virtue of your education, which has got you into a job, which brings you a certain income. I mean, it's all highly intertwined, and it's sort of, you know, these sort of education and income are really proxies for all sorts of things that we can't really put our, you know, our finger on. And I mean, remember, this is sort of statistical on average. I mean, it's not saying that, you know, every educated person is going to be healthy or every obese person is going to be sick. And in fact, there's some literature showing that there are sort of subgroups within that obesity subgroup where some obese people are very, very healthy and live to an old age. So we're talking here statistical averages in the population as a whole, and none of this really can be taken to apply to any one individual. But it does raise some sort of interesting questions of why and to what extent this might actually translate into personal dynamics.
Dr. Barry Goldlist, who's a geriatrician here, did a lecture back in June, and he said that women would do well to have a few extra pounds on them. It's healthier.
Yep.
And get off calcium and get off cholesterol-lowering drugs.
Yeah. Well, I also I feel that my weight now is a healthy weight because I've got some padding on my hips, and if I fall over, it will prevent it, protect me, and it means that as an old woman, I don't have to go around with wearing great big ugly pads.
So we want to thank you again, everyone, for attending, and especially Elizabeth for this enlightening presentation. We have a little.
Oh, thank you very much.
Now we would love you to fill out the evaluation forms.